Hello, everyone, and welcome back in another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy Thursday to you all. We are kind of in the midst of the weekend already in terms of the NFL. We got Thursday night action tonight between the New England Patriots and the New York Jets. Going to touch a little bit on that, but before we get into topics of that nature, I'm going to do a little segment where I make some comments about certain players in which I say don't be surprised if one thing over another happens. I think that's an interesting segment. I want to test it on you guys, see what you guys think about it, and then for tonight's game, I'm going to talk about some of the players in terms of fantasy implications who I feel have a lot to prove tonight in this game. Then I'm going to look at some general Week 3 prop bets. We covered Thursday Night Football's prop bets for this game, and then I'm also going to round out my positional rankings with the defenses and special teams who I think will have decent weekends. And last but not least, I'm going to switch to the realm of college football and talk about some big games coming up in week before. But before we get into any of that nice action, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned, especially me and my fellow podcasters. Another thing which you guys have been doing a fantastic job of doing, Super Chat, Super Thanks. Ooh, I got the graphic right in front of me right now. Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features can be made available to you. They are a great way to contribute to the show. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, I would love to hear them. They are a great way to get your input out there into the show, get your opinion rather than mine almost all the time in the show as well. So make of this what you will, contribute what you will. I promise the show will get bigger and better because of it. Without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day here. And let's talk about the Don't Be Surprised segment. This is a little segment I'm kind of inspired by from ESPN. They did their own segment, so I was like, why not, make my own segment about certain outcomes that could happen in this weekend's game that we might be surprised about, but I am forewarning you with this segment about. So, without further ado, there are a couple that I really like here, and I want to present them to you right now. The first one is, don't be surprised if Lamar Jackson has more rushing yards than passing yards this weekend against the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the reason I say this is because it's not necessarily fate of circumstance, right, for Lamar Jackson to have more rushing yards than passing yards. But I do believe that it will come down to the fact that I don't believe the Ravens offense believes in its offensive line's protection. We've seen it through 2 games. We especially saw it in that game against the Chiefs where Lamar certainly had to play hero ball to keep Baltimore in that game and get them to that point where they were literally a toenail away from taking that game potentially to overtime or winning it. So it will all come down to, Lamar doing what Lamar needs to do in order to win this game. And it's against the Cowboys, who are a Jekyll and Hyde team right now in the NFL. I don't necessarily know how to think about them or what to think about them right now on either side of the ball. So this is going to be a very interesting game where a certain contrast of styles could come into play, where we see Lamar running a little bit more to try and stretch the Dallas defense a little bit, and in return, I think that Dallas will want to focus on the weaknesses of this Ravens running attack, which is if they hand the ball off to Derrick Henry, because I still do not think that Derrick Henry adds much value to that backfield. I'm sorry to any Derrick Henry fantasy football owners, but it's just something I can't get beyond. He just doesn't scream Baltimore Ravens running back to me at this current moment in time. That being said, I do think the Cowboys will want to generate pressure early and often on Lamar, and that could see him scramble a little bit more than we're used to out of him this year. So I think that in terms of fantasy implications, it could pan out to where Lamar has one of those days where he's serviceable enough, 17 to 20 point score in fantasy, but just know that he's not going to be passing heavily in this game, in my humble opinion. I think that he's going to run a lot, use his out-of-structure abilities to gain yardage on the ground a little bit more often. And the next one, this one is a little bit less surprising, but it still is going to shock some of you and make you skeptical based off of the actual matchup. The Browns defense, in my opinion, will not be the top defense. I'm not indicting the Browns defense by any means. I do think that they will have a good week, potentially finish in at least the top 5 in terms of overall defenses. But I think that when I look at many different defenses around the NFL, there's just a lot of shock value in terms of what they bring to the table. Over the past 2 weeks, I've been shocked by a lot of defenses, and later in the show, I'm going to do a segment about all the defenses who, based off of favorable matchups, I think will be the top 5 defenses of the week. The Browns will be included in that segment, just letting you know ahead of time. But I think that when I look at certain matchups and I think about certain teams right now that are trying to get the best out of their defenses, or their defenses are the best units on the team, I'm looking at some teams that are kind of like the Browns in that their defenses are the saving grace of the team, but they're also in kind of prove-it situations where I feel like they're in games where their opponents could view this as a trap game, right? I look at, say, the Bills, the Jags, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. I look at the Texans against the Vikings. Those are all potential trap games where these scrappy defenses could rise from the ashes and really impress. And the Browns, we always know they're going to be one of the best defenses in real life and in fantasy. But this year, it's just so all over the place when it comes to how we view defenses right now. So the Browns still think they'll be top 5, but not number 1 overall. Then let's get into the backup QBs for this week, because I do believe that at the end of the day, a backup QB will finish top 15 in fantasy, whether it's Skylar Thompson, if he even starts against my Seattle Seahawks, or Malik Willis, who could be playing his last game as a Green Bay Packer, ironically going up against his former team in the Tennessee Titans. I think that there's a lot of value to these guys. I think that when you look at the systems they have around them, yes, we saw Malik Willis before and not Skylar Thompson, and we saw what Matt LaFleur was thinking in that regard in terms of his game plan and how it was more about the run game, really run heavy in that game. Josh Jacobs over 150 yards. But when I look at Skylar Thompson, right, I don't necessarily want him to perform that well as a Seahawks fan, but he does have the weapons to do it. And he can move the football even if he's not throwing it 50, 60 yards down the field like you would have expected Tua to. So if McDaniel plays a dink and dunk style and he relies on the speed that he has to get yards after the catch, then Skylar Thompson can put up gaudy numbers even though he's not doing the dirty work and getting it, if you see what I'm saying. And then Malik Willis, he's just a serviceable, competent guy who you hopefully think that he's not going to turn the ball over, protects the football, and going against his former team with nothing to lose here, I think that he could have a big game. That being said, this is one of the more riskier opinions I have from my own kind of personal research here. But that being said, look at the offenses around them, look at the ways they could be used. I potentially think that these two guys have at least one good fantasy game in them. You might not want them on your team, but in a deeper league, you might want to take a shot at them or flyer on them this week. And the last one I have here, probably my most far-fetched one for this weekend, the Bears and the Colts, both Caleb Williams and Anthony Richardson will have the best fantasy performances of the week at the QB position. This is outlandish, I know, right? But I think about this matchup, and I think about where both of these teams are in terms of how they're getting these young quarterbacks involved in their squads. If you think about it, both of them are quote-unquote rookies. Obviously, Anthony Richardson is technically a second-year player, but because of the injury, he didn't get much game time last year, and Caleb, kind of thrown into the fire, expected to be one of the biggest faces of the Chicago Bears in recent memory. with all the receivers that he has at his disposal. So it's all going to be about the messiness of this game. I think that this game, if it gets messy, the potential for both of these guys to put up gaudy numbers. And by no means am I saying that this game is going to be a shootout, because there's a likelier chance of it being low scoring than both of these quarterbacks combining for fantastic fantasy performances. But it's not far-fetched to say that because both of these teams are at such weird points in their quote-unquote rebuilds, that both of these squads will want to take advantage of their weaknesses. I like the Bears' defense a lot, but its youth kind of gives me pause against teams like the Colts, who can try and exploit them deep. And so if Anthony Richardson sees a matchup he likes, be wary of that. He is such a big play potential kind of guy, but it all stemmed from how this offense fits around him. And then on the Caleb side of things, you got to expect that sometime against, say, an opponent like Indy, he's going to have a big game, and he's going to put up the numbers that you expect out of him in this squad. It was not a performance to remember for him against Houston this week, but I think that with time, if he starts to believe in this offense a little bit more, starts to get connected with all his receivers, he will start to have better games. It's going to be a long process for Caleb to get to where the fans of Chicago, head coach Matt Eberflus, want him to be, but at this current juncture, I think this game, if it gets messy, there could be a lot of points to be had here. But this is just my humble opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments, because there are so many ways this weekend could go, so many intriguing storylines. And if you want my honest opinion, I don't think that any of these will come true. They're just thoughts that I had. But let me know what you think. Let me know what your opinions are in terms of bold proclamations for the week in fantasy. But coming up next, we look at Thursday Night Football yet again, this time looking at some of the biggest players with the most to prove in this matchup tonight. We'll be right back to talk about that after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord,